His son threw him into the snow with $2, but the old SEAL's dog led him to a secret buried for 40 years. Snow fell hard across the Colorado porch as 72-year-old Navy SEAL Frank Mercer stood barefoot beside a military duffel and a locked front door. His son wouldn't look him in the eyes. His loyal K9 Shadow growled low into the darkness like he sensed something coming. 48 hours later, deep in the Montana mountains, the dog would uncover a sealed cabin hiding a truth powerful men had killed to keep buried. Comment 1 if you'd fight for the truth, or 0 if you think Frank should have walked away, and tell us where you're watching from. There is a kind of silence that only exists after betrayal. Not the silence of snowfall drifting across empty streets. Not the silence of dawn before the world wakes up. This silence is different, heavier, colder. It settles inside a man's chest and presses there until breathing itself feels like work. Frank Mercer heard that silence standing barefoot on the frozen concrete porch of his son's house in Aurora, Colorado, while snow began falling from a dark November sky. The deadbolt clicked behind him. Then the chain slid into place. The sound was soft, ordinary, but it ended something. 11 seconds earlier, Frank had still believed he lived there. 11 seconds. That was how long Tyler Mercer stood at the kitchen counter, staring into a coffee mug, while his wife destroyed what remained of his father's life. Frank remembered every second of it. Elaine had moved first. Not angry, not screaming. Calm people could do terrible things when they decided guilt was inconvenient. She grabbed the old military duffel from beside the basement stairs and carried it to the front door with the efficient movements of someone taking out trash before a snowstorm. "Elaine," Frank had said quietly. She never looked at him. "We talked about this." No, she had talked. Tyler had listened. That was different. Frank looked toward his son. Tyler stood beside the coffee maker in gray sweatpants and socks, shoulders slightly hunched, staring into the steam rising from his mug, like the answer might be floating somewhere inside it. 48 years old. Frank remembered holding him in a hospital room in Virginia Beach after the boy's mother nearly died during labor. Remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, how to shake a man's hand while looking him in the eye. Now Tyler couldn't even look at him. "Say something," Frank had said. Tyler tightened his grip on the mug. That was second number 6. By second 8, Elaine had opened the front door. Cold wind rushed into the kitchen. Snowflakes swirled across the hardwood floor. Shadow rose immediately. The German Shepherd had been sleeping near the basement stairs moments earlier. Now the retired military K9 stood perfectly still between Frank and the doorway, ears forward, amber eyes locked on Elaine with the focused intensity of a soldier assessing threat. "Get that dog back," Elaine snapped. Shadow didn't move. Frank placed a hand lightly against the dog's neck. "It's okay, partner." But it wasn't. Dogs knew things before people admitted them to themselves. Shadow had known for months. The growling whenever Elaine came downstairs. The way he blocked the basement doorway whenever Tyler and Elaine argued upstairs late at night. The way his ears flattened every time Frank packed away another piece of himself to make the household more comfortable. The dog understood territory. He understood rejection. He understood pack behavior. And right now, Shadow understood something Frank still hadn't fully accepted. They were being cast out. Elaine tossed the duffel onto the porch. It landed hard enough for metal zippers to rattle. Then she picked up Frank's old winter coat from the chair near the door and shoved it into his chest. "You can't stay here anymore?" Still, Tyler said nothing. That was second number 10. Frank looked directly at his son. Not angry, not pleading, just waiting. One sentence, one word, anything. Tyler stared down into the coffee mug and took a slow sip. That was second number 11, and Frank understood. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. No burst of rage, no shouting, just clarity. The kind men sometimes found in combat after the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared and they finally understood who hadn't made it home. Frank had spent most of his adult life around danger. Vietnam jungle operations, blackwater insertions during storms in the Persian Gulf, missions so classified even the memories felt buried under concrete. But standing in his son's kitchen while snow blew through the doorway hurt worse than getting shot ever had. Because bullets came from enemies. This came from family. Elaine's hand pressed firmly against his shoulder blade. Not violent, not emotional, just final. Frank stumbled once as the cold porch met his bare feet. Shadow moved instantly beside him. Then the door slammed shut. Now the old Navy SEAL stood in the swirling snow, listening to the silence afterward. The porch light flickered overhead. Somewhere down the block, a garage door opened. A television glowed blue through a neighbor's curtains. The world kept moving with the terrible indifference of ordinary Tuesday evenings. Frank looked down. His feet were bare except for thin black socks already soaking through from melting snow. His jeans were old but clean. His thermal shirt hung loose on his thinner frame. He had lost nearly 30 pounds during the past 3 years, though nobody in the house had mentioned it aloud. Old age made people uncomfortable, especially when it arrived slowly inside their own homes. Shadow stood beside him without making a sound. Snow gathered along the dog's scarred muzzle. Frank reached automatically for his coat pocket. $2 bills. 14 cents in coins. That was everything. $2.14. 72 years old. Decorated former Navy SEAL. No home. No car. No phone plan, because Tyler had canceled it 3 weeks earlier to save money. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Not from weakness. Calculation. Men survived by assessing reality quickly. Panic got people killed. He had learned that in places most Americans would never hear about. The porch smelled faintly of wet cedar and cigarette smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Frank bent slowly, picked up the duffel, and slung it over one shoulder. The zipper had split open slightly. Inside he could see folded thermal shirts, an old shaving kit, military paperwork, and the corner of a framed photograph. Helen, his wife, dead 6 years now. Shadow pressed close against his leg as another gust of snow swept across the porch. Frank glanced once toward the frosted front window. Through the curtains, he could see Tyler's silhouette still standing in the kitchen, not moving, not coming after him. Frank felt something inside himself shut down quietly. Not love, not even hope, expectation. That was worse to lose, because once expectation died, a man stopped waiting for rescue. He adjusted the duffel and stepped off the porch. Shadow followed instantly. The neighborhood streets stretched ahead under fresh snow and orange streetlights. Rows of identical suburban homes lined the block, warm and glowing against the Colorado darkness. Frank had lived in Tyler's basement for 8 years. 8 years of trying not to take up space. 8 years of fixing broken sinks, mowing lawns, cooking dinners, folding laundry, and making himself useful enough to justify his existence. At first, Tyler had called it temporary. Just until you get back on your feet, Dad. But grief had weight. Medical bills had weight. PTSD had weight. And over time, those things turned a temporary stay into quiet exile beneath another man's roof. Frank and Shadow walked slowly down the sidewalk. Snow crunched beneath Frank's soaked socks. At the corner of the street stood the community mailbox station. Frank paused there beneath the weak overhead light and leaned one hand briefly against the cold metal. His chest tightened suddenly. Not physical pain. Memory. A helicopter rotor somewhere far away inside his head. Gunfire. Rain hitting jungle leaves. A young Marine screaming for a medic. Frank inhaled sharply. Shadow immediately turned and nudged his hand. Once. Firm. Grounding him. Frank blinked hard. The neighborhood returned. Streetlights. Snow. Cold air. Not Vietnam. Not the Gulf. Not Afghanistan. Colorado. Now. Good boy, Frank whispered hoarsely. Shadow stayed pressed against him until the shaking in Frank's hand stopped. The dog had done that for years, sometimes before nightmares, sometimes during panic attacks, sometimes during grocery store crowds when too many people boxed Frank in and his breathing started going sideways. Military dogs were trained for detection, explosives, threat assessment, tracking. But nobody talked enough about how some of them learned to detect broken human beings. Frank kept walking. The city bus station downtown was several miles away, but buses still ran through Aurora until midnight. Maybe he could stay there until morning. Figure something out after that. The snow thickened as they reached Colfax Avenue. Traffic hissed past on wet asphalt. People inside heated cars glanced briefly toward the old man and the German shepherd walking through the storm, then looked away. A homeless veteran and his dog were not unusual enough to hold attention long anymore. That was the thing about America. It could admire soldiers deeply while still failing them quietly. Frank stopped beneath the awning of a closed hardware store and finally pulled the photograph from the partly opened duffel. Helen smiled back at him from behind scratched glass. Taken 20 years earlier beside a fishing dock in Montana. Wind in her hair. Laughing at something he'd forgotten. Frank stared at the picture while snow drifted sideways across the empty parking lot. I screwed this up, Hel, he whispered. Shadow sat beside him watching the street. Always watching. A police cruiser rolled slowly past. The officer glanced toward them but kept driving. Frank slipped the photograph carefully back inside the duffel. Then he noticed something strange. Shadow wasn't watching traffic anymore. The dog stared back toward the direction of Tyler's neighborhood. Rigid. Focused. Low growl vibrating in his throat. Frank followed the dog's gaze. Nothing there except snowfall and distant headlights. Still, Shadow kept staring. Then slowly, the German shepherd moved closer and leaned against Frank's leg with the full weight of his body. Protective, possessive, like he already knew the road ahead was about to get worse. Frank rested one trembling hand against the dog's head. Snow continued falling around them in silence. And somewhere far behind them, inside a warm suburban house, Tyler Mercer stood alone in a brightly lit kitchen staring into an empty coffee mug, while the place where his father had lived for 8 years sat suddenly clean and vacant. But out on Colfax Avenue beneath the storm, Frank Mercer finally understood something he should have learned long ago. A man could survive gunfire. He could survive war. He could survive nightmares, but surviving abandonment required becoming someone entirely different. And tonight, standing homeless beside a loyal dog under the Colorado snow, Frank felt that transformation beginning. Cold, quiet, irreversible. Frank Mercer had learned a long time ago that the worst moments in life rarely arrived with explosions. They arrived softly. A signed paper across a kitchen table. A doctor removing his glasses before speaking. A son staring into a coffee mug instead of his father's eyes. The snow followed Frank and Shadow downtown through the sleeping streets of Aurora. Midnight traffic thinned to scattered headlights, moving through white haze while the city buried itself beneath winter. Frank walked with the slightly uneven stride of a man whose body remembered too many injuries. His right knee stiffened in cold weather from an old helicopter insertion, gone wrong in 1983. His lower back carried permanent damage from carrying wounded men through terrain no human being should have crossed on foot. At 72, pain was no longer an event. It was weather. Shadow stayed close beside him, paws silent against wet sidewalks, thick black fur dusted white by snow. The dog's movements remained disciplined despite age. Retired military K9s never entirely lost that alertness. Even now, Shadow scanned alleys, passing vehicles, strangers near intersections, always assessing, always protecting. Frank stopped beneath the glowing overhang of a closed pharmacy and flexed feeling back into his hands. The cold had sharpened everything inside his chest, memories especially. Helen used to hate snowstorms, not because of the cold, because they made Frank restless. "Storms make you walk around like you're waiting for orders," she once told him with a tired smile while they sat beside a fireplace in Virginia Beach nearly 30 years earlier. She had understood him better than anyone ever had. Helen Mercer possessed the rare ability to sit beside silence without trying to fix it. That was what Frank missed most. Not conversation. Permission. Permission to exist without apologizing for it. Shadow nudged Frank's hand again. The old SEAL looked down. "Yeah, partner. I know." The bus station finally appeared 3 blocks ahead through swirling snow and yellow streetlights. It sat beside the rail yard like a concrete bunker abandoned by optimism decades earlier. Fluorescent lights buzzed behind dirty windows. 2 exhausted travelers smoked near the entrance while a city bus hissed at the curb. Warmth hit Frank's face when the station doors slid open. Coffee, wet clothes, cheap disinfectant, human exhaustion. Every American bus station smelled exactly the same after midnight. Shadow entered first automatically, ears up, checking the room. People noticed the dog immediately, not the old man beside him. That part never surprised Frank anymore. Homeless veterans blended into public spaces too easily these days. But a German shepherd, with military posture, still made people look twice. Frank guided Shadow toward the back row of plastic chairs near the vending machines. He lowered the duffel carefully onto the floor and sat with a low exhale as his joints protested. The station television mounted in the corner played muted weather forecasts. A winter storm warning crawled across the bottom of the screen for eastern Colorado and Wyoming. Frank stared at it blankly. Wyoming. The word meant open country. Truck stops. Wind. Distance. The kind of places a man could disappear inside. Shadow lay down beside his boots, but stayed alert. Frank rubbed one hand slowly across the dog's scarred head. The scars ran above Shadow's left eye and along the muzzle. Shrapnel damage from Kandahar according to the adoption records Frank received 6 years earlier. Retired military working dog. Unfit for further service. Needs experienced handler. Frank remembered reading those words at the Veteran Outreach Center in Denver while sitting alone in a folding chair beneath fluorescent lights. That had been 3 years after Helen died. 3 years after the cancer took her quietly in a hospice room that smelled like antiseptic and fading flowers. Frank had held her hand for 14 straight hours near the end because he was terrified that letting go would make it happen faster. Afterward, the house became unbearable. Every room contained echoes, her reading glasses near the sink, her handwriting on grocery lists, the sweater hanging behind the bedroom door because neither of them understood the last morning would actually be the last. Grief hollowed him out slowly after that. Then came the medical bills, then the second mortgage, then the bank. Tyler had offered the basement room before Frank ever asked. "Dad, you don't need to be alone right now." Frank almost smiled remembering it. His son had meant it at the time. That was the tragedy of most betrayals. They usually began as kindness. The first year in Tyler's house had almost felt normal. Frank fixed the leaking kitchen faucet, drove the grandkids to school, grilled hamburgers during summer weekends, folded laundry before Elaine got home from work. Useful. That was the key. As long as he stayed useful, he still occupied a place in the system. But usefulness had an expiration date. Frank noticed the shift gradually. Conversations stopping when he entered rooms. Tyler mentioning rising utility bills, Elaine smiling less, doors closing more often upstairs. Then came the small humiliations. The thermostat adjusted lower after Frank showered. Family dinners beginning without him. Christmas photographs where nobody asked him to stand closer. The basement slowly becoming less like a room and more like storage. Frank had adapted the way soldiers adapted to difficult terrain. Quietly. Reduce footprint. Minimize inconvenience. Take up less space. It became routine. Wake before sunrise. Drink coffee alone downstairs. Walk shadow before everyone else woke up. Repair whatever needed repairing. Disappear when company visited. He stopped sitting in the living room eventually, because Elaine always seemed uncomfortable when he did. The realization hurt more because nobody ever said it directly. That was Tyler's way too. Silence instead of decision. One night, nearly a year earlier, Frank woke from a nightmare, convinced he smelled diesel smoke and blood. His heart hammered violently while Vietnam flooded back into his head with brutal clarity. Rotor blades, fire, rain, screaming. Shadow climbed onto the bed immediately, pressing heavy weight against Frank's chest until reality returned. Then Frank heard voices upstairs through the heating vent. Elaine. Sharp. Exhausted. "How long is this supposed to last?" Tyler answered too quietly to hear. Then clearer. "He's my father. And I'm your wife." Silence. Frank lay motionless in the dark beside Shadow. Then Elaine spoke again. "Either the dog goes or both of them do." The words entered Frank's chest like ice water. Shadow lifted his head immediately beside him. Low growl, almost inaudible. The dog had heard it too. Frank stared at the basement ceiling until sunrise. After that, he began eating less, using less hot water, turning lights off immediately behind him, reducing evidence of himself wherever possible. Because when people started discussing your existence in terms of burden, survival became negotiation. And Frank Mercer had spent enough years in combat zones to recognize retreat before the shooting started. A burst of laughter near the vending machines pulled Frank back to the present. 3 college kids entered the station carrying backpacks and energy drinks, loud with the careless immortality of youth. Shadow watched them carefully until they passed. Frank reached down and opened the duffel slowly. Inside sat his entire remaining life. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, old military records, Helen's photograph, a shaving kit, prescription bottles, 1 flashlight, and a small cedar box containing medals he never displayed. Bronze Star, Navy Commendation Medal, Purple Heart. Metal objects honoring experiences he spent decades trying not to remember. Frank pushed the box deeper into the duffel. No point carrying ghosts near the surface. Across the station, an elderly janitor mopped silently beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Frank watched him for a long moment. Invisible men recognized each other sometimes, not through conversation, through posture. The janitor moved exactly like Frank felt, careful not to disturb anyone, careful not to exist too loudly. Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears forward, focused. Frank followed the dog's gaze toward the station entrance. Nothing unusual, just snow blowing sideways beyond glass doors. Still, the dog remained alert. Then slowly, Shadow turned back and rested his muzzle on Frank's knee, grounding him again, anchoring him to the present before memories drifted too far. Frank closed his eyes briefly. The station noise faded. Somewhere deep inside himself, he could still hear Helen's voice. "You don't disappear just because people stop looking at you." At the time, he hadn't understood what she meant. Tonight, he finally did. Frank opened his eyes and stared through the station windows into the Colorado storm. For 8 years, he had survived by becoming smaller, quieter, more convenient, a ghost living in another family's basement. But now the illusion was gone. There was no basement anymore, no house, no role left to perform. Only an old soldier and his dog sitting in a bus station after midnight while snow buried the city outside. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and humiliation and grief, something unfamiliar had begun stirring quietly inside Frank Mercer. Not hope, not yet, but movement. The kind that happened just before a man stopped surviving passively and started walking towards something unknown. Shadow lifted his head again suddenly. This time the dog's eyes fixed directly on the old military duffel at Frank's feet. Then the German shepherd let out a soft whine. Frank frowned. "What is it?" Shadow nudged the bag once with his nose, then again, insistent. Frank stared at the duffel for a long moment, while snow battered the station windows behind them. And very slowly, something buried deep inside his memory began trying to surface. Shadow nudged the bag again. Once, then twice. The German shepherd's ears stayed forward, eyes fixed on the old military duffel with strange intensity. Frank frowned and crouched stiffly beside it. His knees cracked painfully as he lowered himself onto the cold tile floor near the plastic station chairs. "What are you after, partner?" Shadow whined softly. Not anxious, focused. Frank unzipped the bag fully for the first time since leaving Tyler's house. The smell of old canvas and cedar drifted upward. His belongings sat packed exactly the way he always kept them, folded tightly, practical, military neat even after all these years. He moved aside shirts and socks, then paused. At the very bottom corner of the bag sat a small olive-drab waterproof pouch he hadn't seen in decades. For a moment he simply stared at it. Memory flickered. Virginia. Rain. A younger version of himself kneeling beside a gear locker. Frank slowly picked up the pouch. The zipper resisted at first from age. Shadow sat perfectly still watching him. Inside rested an old brass compass scratched nearly smooth with wear. Frank inhaled sharply. Not because of the compass itself, because he suddenly remembered where it came from. Bitter Creek. The name surfaced fully now. A valley in western Montana tucked deep inside the Bitterroot Mountains near the Idaho border. Frank had not spoken those words aloud in over 50 years, not since he was 17. His mother used to carry the compass inside the glove compartment of an old Ford pickup when they still lived there. Frank remembered her hands on the steering wheel, remembered pine forests sliding past dirt roads, remembered mornings wrapped in mountain fog so thick the world looked unfinished. He also remembered leaving. At 17, Frank had boarded a bus south after one violent fight too many with the drunk man he believed was his father. 3 months later, he enlisted in the Navy, and Bitter Creek disappeared behind decades of war, marriage, deployments, grief, and silence. Frank turned the compass over in his weathered hands. The brass lid had been dented long ago. Then he noticed something unusual. Tiny scratches along the inside edge. Not damage. Writing. His pulse slowed strangely. Frank clicked the compass open. Inside the lid, almost hidden beneath years of tarnish, were faint handwritten words written in black ink. If life corners you, go back to Bitter Creek. Frank stared at the sentence while noise from the station faded around him. His mother's handwriting. No question. Small, neat letters tilted slightly right. He had watched those hands write grocery lists, church notes, birthday cards. He knew the shape of every curve. Shadow let out another low whine. Frank read the message again. If life corners you, not if you need help, not if you want to visit. If life corners you. As though she had known, as though she had expected this exact moment someday. The fluorescent station lights buzzed overhead. Outside, snow buried downtown Denver beneath thick, swirling white. Frank remained crouched on the floor, holding the compass, while old memories drifted through him like smoke. His mother standing beside a wood stove in a mountain cabin, her voice calling him inside before dark, the smell of pine sap and coffee. Then another memory pushed forward harder. Fear. Raised voices. Glass breaking somewhere in the house. The man Frank had grown up calling father stumbling drunk through narrow hallways, while his mother locked doors quietly at night. Frank shut the compass abruptly. His chest tightened. Shadow immediately pressed closer. Easy, Frank muttered, but the memories kept surfacing anyway. Bitter Creek had not been a happy place. Beautiful, but never peaceful. Frank remembered isolation most clearly. The valley sat far beyond any real town, surrounded by logging roads and dense forests where winter storms could bury entire cabins for weeks. His mother loved it there. The man Frank called father hated it, said the valley made him feel trapped. Frank understood that feeling now better than he ever had back then. A loud bang suddenly echoed through the station, someone dropping luggage nearby. Frank reacted instantly. His body jerked sideways before his brain caught up. Heart racing, eyes scanning exits automatically. Combat reflex. Shadow rose immediately, placing himself against Frank's leg until the panic wave passed. The young couple near the vending machine glanced over nervously. Frank looked away first. Shame followed panic attacks now. It always did. He sat back down heavily in the plastic chair and rubbed trembling fingers across the compass lid. Bitter Creek. The name settled inside him differently this time. Not memory. Direction. A bus announcement crackled overhead. Westbound departure to Cheyenne delayed due to weather. Frank looked toward the departure board. Wyoming. West. Closer to Montana. Closer to Bitter Creek. He checked his pocket again. $2.14. Not enough for a bus ticket halfway across Denver. Frank almost laughed. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion, the absurdity of the situation finally surfaced. Former Navy SEAL. Decorated veteran. Homeless with a military dog and $2 while holding a 50-year-old compass like some desperate treasure map. Shadow placed one paw gently against Frank's knee. The dog's eyes never left him. Steady. Trusting. Frank exhaled slowly. You really want us heading north, don't you? Shadow's ears lifted instantly at the word north. Frank noticed it immediately. A strange feeling crawled slowly up his spine. The dog recognized something, not just the tone of voice, the direction itself. How the hell would you know anything about Bitter Creek? Shadow simply stared at him. The station clock read 2:17 a.m. Most travelers slept slumped in plastic chairs now, while snowstorm winds moaned faintly through gaps near the entrance doors. Frank leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. Not sleeping. Thinking. He tried remembering the last time he had seen the compass before tonight. Virginia Beach, maybe. No. Earlier. California during SEAL training. The compass had traveled with him for years before disappearing somewhere inside old gear. And somehow his mother had hidden that message where he would only find it after losing everything else. Not before. After. A movement near the station entrance caught his attention. An older man in a trucker jacket stepped inside, stamping snow from heavy boots. He carried a thermos and smelled strongly of diesel fuel and cold air. The man noticed Shadow immediately. Military dog? Frank nodded once. Retired. The trucker crouched slightly near Shadow. The German shepherd sniffed him briefly, but remained cautious. Beautiful animal, the man said quietly. Saved my nephew overseas. Dogs like that. Frank gave a faint nod. The man studied Frank for another moment. Not judgmental, just observant. You heading somewhere? Frank looked down at the compass in his hands. Maybe Montana. The trucker raised an eyebrow. In this weather? Didn't exactly plan it. The man nodded slowly, like someone who understood more than he asked. Roads west are ugly tonight, especially through Wyoming. Frank almost said he'd handled worse conditions in combat zones halfway across the planet. But exhaustion stole the energy for pride. Instead, he simply nodded again. The trucker unscrewed his thermos and held it out. Coffee. Frank hesitated, then accepted it. The heat burned pleasantly through frozen fingers. Appreciate it. Name's Earl. Frank. Earl glanced once toward Shadow. That dog won't let anything happen to you. Frank looked down at the shepherd resting beside his boots. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm starting to figure that out. Earl leaned against the wall beside the chairs while snow hammered the windows. I'm hauling equipment north through Casper at sunrise if roads open enough. Not much room in the cab, but enough for a man and a dog. Frank stared at him. You serious? Earl shrugged. World gets cold enough sometimes. Doesn't cost much not to make it colder. The sentence hit Frank harder than expected. Because kindness felt unfamiliar now. Dangerous, almost. He had spent so long minimizing himself inside Tyler's house that simple human decency startled him. Frank looked down again at the compass resting in his palm. If life corners you, go back to Bitter Creek. The words no longer felt accidental. They felt like orders. Shadow suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the station doors. A low growl rolled from deep inside the dog's chest. Frank turned immediately. Outside, beyond swirling snow, a dark SUV sat idling across the street beneath a flickering lamppost. Its headlights remained off. Engine running. Frank narrowed his eyes. Maybe nothing. Maybe someone staying warm. But Shadow remained rigid beside him, watching, waiting. The old instincts inside Frank Mercer stirred quietly awake. And for the first time since Tyler closed that door behind him, Frank began to feel something other than humiliation. Suspicion, movement, purpose. Somewhere far north beyond Wyoming highways and frozen mountain roads, Bitter Creek waited buried beneath snow and memory. And somehow, impossibly, Shadow already seemed to know the way. The dark SUV remained parked across the street from the Denver bus station until dawn. Frank noticed it each time he looked through the snow-covered windows during the long, restless night. The engine occasionally rumbled softly. Once, headlights flickered on briefly before going dark again. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. Years of military work had taught Frank Mercer one dangerous truth. Instincts existed for a reason. Shadow never stopped watching the vehicle. Around 5 a.m, the storm weakened slightly. Pale blue dawn began bleeding slowly into the eastern sky behind downtown buildings, while exhausted travelers stirred awake in plastic chairs. Earl returned carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches wrapped in paper towels. One for you, he said. One plain sausage for the soldier there. Shadow's ears lifted immediately. Frank hesitated before accepting the food. Pride had once mattered deeply to him, but hunger eventually sanded pride down into practicality. Thank you. Earl shrugged out of his heavy jacket and sat nearby. Road crews opened I-25 north about an hour ago. Wyoming's still ugly, though. Frank unwrapped the sandwich slowly. The smell alone made his stomach ache. He realized he hadn't eaten since early afternoon the previous day. Shadow waited patiently beside him. Frank tore the sausage in half automatically before eating his own portion. Military habit. Nobody under your command ate after you did. Even dogs. Outside, the SUV finally pulled away from the curb and disappeared into snowy morning traffic. Shadow continued staring through the window several seconds after it vanished. Frank noticed that too. By 6:30, They were on the road north. Earl drove a faded blue Freightliner hauling industrial piping toward Casper. The truck's cab smelled like coffee, diesel fuel, tobacco, and cold mountain air leaking through old seals around the windows. Frank sat silently in the passenger seat, while shadow stretched across the sleeper compartment behind them. Snow-covered Colorado plains rolled past beneath pale winter light. White fences, frozen fields, oil pumps moving slowly against distant hills. The world looked stripped down to essentials. Frank appreciated that. Complicated things had exhausted him lately. "You military long?" Earl asked eventually. Frank kept his eyes on the highway. "Most my life." "Navy?" "SEAL teams." Earl gave a low whistle. "Well, hell." Frank said nothing further. Most veterans learned eventually that civilians either romanticized war too much or understood it too little. Silence became easier. The truck crossed into Wyoming shortly before noon. The weather worsened almost immediately. Wind slammed snow across the interstate hard enough to erase sections of road. Traffic slowed to cautious crawling speeds behind salt trucks. Frank watched endless white plains stretch beneath dark skies, while memories kept surfacing in fragments. Bitter Creek. His mother standing beside a river wrapped in a heavy wool coat. A cabin porch buried in snow. Pine smoke drifting through mountain air. Then another memory interrupted. His stepfather's voice. Drunk. Angry. A plate shattering against a wall. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Shadow lifted his head from the sleeper compartment immediately. The dog sensed it before the panic fully arrived. Always. Frank inhaled slowly through his nose. Diesel fumes filled the cab. Ground yourself. Focus on now. A technique. A counselors had tried teaching him years ago. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The worst attacks came unexpectedly. Loud noises usually triggered them. Helicopter blades, fireworks, sudden shouting. But crowds were worse. Crowds trapped you, made exits disappear. Around Rawlins, traffic stopped completely after a jackknifed semi-blocked part of the interstate. Hundreds of vehicles sat motionless while snow whipped across the highway. Emergency lights flashed ahead. Earl shut off the engine. "Could be a while." Frank nodded stiffly. His breathing had already changed. Too shallow, too fast. The trapped line of vehicles suddenly felt wrong, dangerous, like a convoy stalled inside hostile territory. His fingers tightened unconsciously against the seat. Shadow climbed forward instantly. The German shepherd pressed his body against Frank's chest hard enough to force physical awareness back into him. Pressure therapy. The VA trainer had explained it once. Military dogs sometimes learned grounding behaviors naturally around damaged handlers. Frank focused on the dog's weight, the warmth of fur, the smell of snow and animal and leather harness. Not helicopters, not jungle rain, not burning fuel. Now. Stay in now. Shadow rested his muzzle beneath Frank's trembling hand until the panic wave slowly passed. Earl pretended not to notice. Good man. Outside, Wyoming wind screamed across frozen plains, while snow buried tire tracks almost as quickly as they formed. After nearly 2 hours, traffic finally moved again. By dusk, they reached Casper. Truck stoplights glowed against the darkening storm like ships at sea. Earl parked beside dozens of idling rigs while snow continued piling against tires and concrete barriers. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked. Frank looked toward the truck stop windows. Warm yellow light. People eating dinner. Normal life continuing behind glass. "No." Earl rubbed one hand across his beard thoughtfully. "Manager usually lets drivers use shower vouchers. I'll get you cleaned up at least." Frank started to object automatically, then stopped. Survival required adaptation, too. Inside, the truck stop smelled of coffee, frying grease, and wet winter coats. Country music played softly from ceiling speakers, while exhausted drivers crowded booths beneath mounted televisions. People glanced at Shadow, but nobody complained. The old military service harness still carried authority. Frank washed in a narrow shower room while Shadow waited outside the door. Hot water pounded stiff muscles until steam filled the tiny space completely. For the first time since Tyler threw him out, Frank saw himself clearly in the fogged mirror. Older than he remembered. Much older. Deep lines cut across weathered skin. Gray stubble covered his jaw. Scars crossed both shoulders like faded maps. But it was the eyes that unsettled him most. Tired eyes. The eyes of a man who had spent too long apologizing for still existing. When he emerged, Shadow stood immediately and pressed close against him. The dog checked him every time, as if making sure Frank had actually returned. Earl insisted they join him for dinner at the diner counter inside the truck stop. The waitress's name tag read Marlene, mid-50s, sharp eyes, tired smile. She noticed Frank's old Navy tattoo while pouring coffee. Then she noticed Shadow's harness. Something softened in her expression immediately. "You boys traveling far?" "Montana," Earl answered before Frank could. Marlene looked surprised. "In this weather?" Frank managed a faint shrug. "Been through worse." Marlene studied him another second too long. Not pity. Recognition. America contained more veterans than most people realized. Sometimes they spotted each other without words. She returned several minutes later, carrying an extra plate piled with bacon and eggs. "I didn't order this," Frank said quietly. "You did now." Frank opened his mouth to protest. Marlene shook her head once. "My brother came home from Fallujah different. Some days people fed him when he needed it." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Shadow. "Looks like that dog's still on duty." Shadow rested beneath the counter beside Frank's boots while snow hammered the diner windows. Frank ate slowly. Not because he wanted to stretch the meal, because nobody had cooked for him without obligation in a very long time. The feeling nearly hurt. Later that night, Earl spread blankets across the truck sleeper for the Frank while Shadow curled protectively nearby. Truck engines vibrated softly across the frozen parking lot outside. Frank couldn't sleep. Wyoming wind rocked the cab gently, while old thoughts moved through him in restless waves. At some point after midnight, he finally whispered into darkness, "Why Bitter Creek?" Shadow lifted his head immediately. The dog stared directly at him. Then, very slowly, Shadow stood and placed one paw against the old military duffel lying beside the bunk, the same bag containing the compass. Frank felt cold move slowly through his chest. "You know something." Not a question. The dog held his gaze, then laid back down without making a sound. Morning came gray and brutal. The storm had deepened overnight. Interstate closures flashed across truck stop televisions, while drivers crowded weather reports near the coffee station. Earl cursed quietly. "Road north to Montana's gonna be hell." Frank looked toward the windows. Snow drifted nearly halfway up parked tires now. Most people saw weather. Frank saw terrain, and terrain meant movement. He adjusted the strap on the duffel and looked down at Shadow. The German Shepherd stood immediately. Ready. Always ready. Marlene intercepted Frank near the exit. Without speaking, she pressed a folded paper bag into his hands. Sandwiches, apples, dog treats. Frank looked up. "You don't have to, I know." The truck stoplights reflected softly in her tired eyes. Then she glanced toward Shadow. "That dog didn't give up on you. Don't you give up on yourself either." The words stayed with Frank long after they left Casper behind. By afternoon, Earl dropped them near a smaller highway junction, where Montana-bound freight routes split west through the mountains. The wind there felt sharper, cleaner. Snow-covered peaks loomed faintly against the horizon, like ghosts waking through cloud cover. Earl shook Frank's hand firmly. "You get stuck out there, you find truckers. Most of us still remember how to help people." Frank nodded once. "Thank you." Earl crouched briefly beside Shadow. "You take care of him." Shadow stared back calmly. Then the freightliner disappeared north into blowing snow. Silence settled across the highway afterward. Frank stood alone beside the road with his duffel, his dog, and endless mountains waiting somewhere ahead. He looked down at the compass once more. If life corners you, go back to Bitter Creek. The words no longer felt mysterious. They felt inevitable. And as Frank and Shadow began walking west into the frozen Wyoming wilderness, neither of them noticed the dark SUV parked nearly half a mile away on a ridge overlooking the highway. Watching. Waiting. Following. The dark SUV stayed far enough behind to disappear whenever Frank looked directly for it. But Shadow knew. Dogs noticed patterns human beings ignored. Scent. Distance. Repetition. 3 separate times along the Wyoming highway, the German Shepherd stopped walking and turned toward empty stretches of snow-covered road behind them. Each time his ears rose sharply. Each time low warning growls vibrated deep inside his chest. And each time, several minutes later, headlights appeared in the distance. The same dark SUV, never close, never passing, just there. By the second day, Frank stopped believing in coincidence. The mountains rose slowly around them as they pushed northwest through Montana. Endless plains gave way to pine-covered ridges and frozen river valleys buried beneath heavy winter snow. The cold became something alive out there. It crawled through boots, sat inside lungs, turned breath into smoke. Frank and Shadow moved mostly by hitching short rides from truckers, ranchers, and supply drivers willing to take them partway through isolated stretches of road. At night, they slept inside abandoned rest stops or maintenance sheds when luck allowed. The farther north they traveled, the quieter the world became. Frank preferred that. Cities carried too much noise, too many reminders. Out here, the silence felt honest. By the afternoon of the 4th day, they reached the outskirts of a tiny Montana town called Ashton Ridge. One gas station, one diner, one blinking traffic light swaying slightly in mountain wind. Frank stood beside the road, studying the compass again. Bitter Creek. The name still pulled at him strangely. Not emotionally anymore, physically. Like memory had become geography. Shadow paced restlessly beside him. Then suddenly, the dog pulled hard westward, toward the mountains. Frank tightened his grip on the leash. "What is it?" Shadow whined sharply and kept pulling. The road leading west out of Ashton Ridge looked abandoned. Snow buried most of the asphalt beneath wind drifts. A faded wooden sign leaned sideways near the tree line. Bitterroot National Forest, seasonal access closed. Frank stared toward the mountains beyond. Something tightened inside his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The air smelled different here. Pine, snow, river water, childhood. He hadn't realized how deeply memory attached itself to scent until that moment. Shadow barked once, impatient. "All right," Frank muttered. "Easy." They started west. The road narrowed quickly into old logging paths cutting through dense pine forest. Snow muffled everything except wind moving through branches overhead. The deeper they went, the more Shadow's behavior changed. The old military dog stopped hesitating entirely. No confusion, no uncertainty. He moved with absolute direction now. Frank noticed it immediately. "You've been here before." The words escaped before he could stop them. Shadow glanced back briefly but kept moving. Impossible. Frank adopted Shadow through a veteran rehabilitation program in Denver 6 years earlier. According to military records, the dog had served overseas before retirement. Montana was never mentioned. Yet the German Shepherd navigated those forest roads like remembered territory. Dusk arrived early beneath storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Snow began falling harder as temperatures dropped sharply. Frank's knee burned with each step now. Old injuries hated mountain terrain. Still, they kept moving. Then the forest suddenly opened. Frank stopped cold. The valley spread below them exactly as he remembered, and completely different at the same time. Bitter Creek. Snow-covered meadows stretched between dark pine forests and frozen river bends twisting through the valley floor. Mountains rose sharply on all sides, turning the entire place into a hidden bowl of white and shadow. And there, half buried beneath decades of isolation, stood the cottage. Frank felt the breath leave him slowly. Stone foundation, timber walls, sloped roof heavy with snow. The cabin sat near the edge of the frozen creek, surrounded by towering pines bending under winter weight. He had not seen it since 1968, yet he recognized it instantly. Shadow broke into a sudden run. The German Shepherd charged downhill through deep snow with startling energy for an aging dog. Frank struggled after him, nearly slipping twice on icy ground. "Shadow!" The dog ignored him completely. By the time Frank reached the clearing, Shadow was already circling the cabin frantically, barking, digging near one corner of the foundation, whining sharply. The cottage looked abandoned at first glance. Every window had been boarded shut from outside using thick, weathered planks. Rusted chains wrapped around the front door. Strange, faded symbols had been carved into the porch beams long ago. Not decorative, military. Frank recognized them immediately. Old reconnaissance markings. His pulse quickened. What the hell? Snow drifted across the porch steps while mountain wind moaned through trees overhead. The place should have been dead. Instead, it felt waiting. Shadow suddenly stopped digging and pressed against the front door, tail rigid, whining softly. Then Frank noticed something impossible. Smoke. Very faint. Barely visible against snowfall, but definitely there. Thin gray smoke drifting upward from the chimney. Fresh. Frank stared upward in disbelief. Someone had been here recently. He moved automatically then. Military instincts taking over. Scan perimeter. Check tracks. Assess entry points. Snow covered most ground cleanly except for older, partially buried footprints near the woods behind the cabin. Human. Recent enough. Frank turned slowly, studying tree lines. No movement. Still, the feeling remained. Watched. Shadow positioned himself between Frank and the forest, while staring into the darkness beyond the clearing. Protective. Alert. Frank stepped onto the porch carefully. The boards creaked beneath his weight exactly the way they used to when he was a boy sneaking inside after dark. Memory hit him hard again. His mother sitting near the fireplace reading. Coffee simmering on the stove. Snowstorms rattling windows while she hummed softly to herself. Then another memory surfaced behind it. Fighting. Yelling. A whiskey bottle smashing against the wall. Frank pushed the thoughts away. The present mattered now. He examined the chains around the front door. Old but solid. Padlocked. Whoever sealed the cabin had wanted it closed permanently. Yet the smoke said otherwise. Frank searched the porch until he found an old iron-splitting wedge half buried beneath snow near the woodpile. He wedged it between chain links and pulled hard. The old metal groaned. Again. Again. Finally, the rusted chain snapped loose and crashed against the porch floor. The sound echoed across the valley. Shadow spun immediately toward the forest with a low growl. Frank froze. Listening. Nothing. only wind. He turned the handle slowly. The door creaked inward. Warm air touched his face. Frank stopped breathing for one full second. Warm. Not abandoned. Not frozen. Warm. Shadow entered first immediately, moving room to room with disciplined speed. Clearing. Checking. Frank followed slowly behind and stopped dead. The cottage was perfectly preserved. Not ruined. Not decayed. Preserved. Furniture sat covered beneath clean white sheets. Firewood had been stacked neatly beside the stone fireplace where glowing embers still hid beneath fresh ash. A lantern rested on the kitchen table beside a metal coffee cup. Frank recognized the cup instantly. His mother's. The exact same dent near the rim from when he dropped it as a child. The sight of it hit him harder than anything else so far. His knees nearly buckled. 40 years. More than 40 years gone. And somehow the cup still waited exactly where she left it. Shadow moved quietly through the cabin now, nose working constantly. The dog stopped beside the fireplace and sniffed carefully at the stones. Then he looked directly at Frank. Not confused. Expectant. Frank removed his gloves slowly. The warmth inside the cabin carried faint smells beneath the wood smoke. Coffee. Cedar. Gun oil. Human presence. Someone maintained this place. Someone had been keeping it alive. He moved deeper into the cabin carefully. Dust barely covered surfaces. The kitchen shelves remained stocked with canned food and supplies. Blankets lay folded neatly beside a rocking chair near the fire. Then Frank noticed the photographs. Old black and white frames lining the far wall above the fireplace. His chest tightened instantly. One showed his mother standing beside the creek, smiling into sunlight, decades younger than he remembered her. Another showed several men wearing military uniforms outside the cabin sometime during winter. Frank stepped closer slowly. One face froze him completely. Cole Ramsey, younger, maybe 30 years old. Navy SEAL insignia visible on his jacket. Frank stared at the photo in disbelief. Cole Ramsey had served with him during operations overseas. Official records listed him dead, killed in Afghanistan nearly 15 years earlier. But that wasn't the worst part. The German shepherd sitting beside Cole in the photograph was unmistakable. Same amber eyes, same scar above the muzzle. Shadow. Frank turned slowly toward the dog. Shadow stared back silently from beside the fireplace. Snow hammered the cabin roof overhead, while fire embers cracked softly in the darkness. And for the first time since reaching Bitter Creek, Frank Mercer understood something truly impossible was happening. The dog had not simply led him here. Shadow already knew this place. Somewhere outside, beyond the snow-covered forest, a branch snapped sharply. Shadow reacted instantly. The German shepherd spun toward the darkened windows with deep, violent growls rumbling through the cabin. Frank moved automatically toward the fireplace poker beside the hearth. Then came another sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin outside. Someone else had found Bitter Creek, too. The footsteps moved slowly through the snow around the cottage. Crunch, pause, crunch, measured, careful. Frank tightened his grip around the iron fireplace poker, while Shadow positioned himself directly in front of the door, muscles rigid beneath thick black fur. The dog's growl deepened. Not fear. Warning. Frank killed the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the cabin except for faint orange glow from dying embers inside the fireplace. The footsteps stopped. Silence settled over the valley again. Frank listened carefully. Old instincts returned with disturbing speed. Count breathing. Track sound direction. Identify exits. The years had buried those reflexes beneath grief and aging and humiliation, but not deeply enough. not permanently. A soft scrape came from the porch, someone touching the broken chain. Frank moved silently toward the side window and pulled back one corner of the hanging blanket covering it. Snow swirled outside beneath moonlight. A figure stood near the porch steps. Male, heavy winter coat, flashlight in one hand. The beam swept slowly across the cabin exterior. Searching. Shadow's growl sharpened. The man froze instantly, then turned directly toward the window. Frank stepped back automatically. Military. That reaction was military. The stranger moved carefully now, scanning angles instead of wandering blindly. Not local curiosity. Training. Frank's chest tightened. The man approached the front door slowly and knocked twice. Not loud, controlled. "Whoever's inside," the voice called through the storm. "This property belongs to Granger Holdings. You're trespassing." Frank said nothing. The voice continued. "We saw smoke." We. Not alone then. Shadow barked once violently. The man outside stepped backward immediately. Again. Training. Frank's eyes narrowed. Granger Holdings. The name meant nothing yet, but the tone behind it did. Ownership. Control. The kind of voice wealthy men hired to guard expensive secrets. "You need to leave," the stranger warned. "Roads out of here get dangerous after dark." Frank almost smiled at that. Men who issued polite warnings in isolated places were usually more dangerous than men who shouted. The footsteps retreated slowly off the porch. Then silence returned. Shadow remained at the door another full minute before backing away. Frank waited longer. 10 minutes. 15. Only wind afterward. Finally, he relit the lantern. Warm yellow light filled the cabin again. Shadow moved immediately back toward the fireplace wall where the photographs hung. Frank followed slowly. The picture of Cole Ramsey still sat there waiting beneath dustless glass. Younger, alive, standing beside Shadow. Frank picked up the frame carefully. His hands shook slightly now, not from fear but confusion. Cole Ramsey had vanished during an operation near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border 14 years earlier. Official reports listed him killed after a convoy ambush. Body unrecovered. Frank remembered attending the memorial service in Virginia. Remembered standing beside Cole's widow while folded flags changed hands beneath gray rain. Yet here he was, photographed at Bitter Creek. Frank looked closer. The picture had been taken recently compared to the others, maybe 5 or 6 years old, not decades. Cole's hair showed gray near the temples, and Shadow looked older too. The dog nudged Frank's leg again. "You knew him." Shadow's ears lifted slightly. Frank stared at the shepherd. "You came from him, didn't you?" The dog remained silent, but something in Frank's chest shifted. A connection forming slowly between scattered pieces. Bitter Creek. Cole Ramsey. The compass. The dog. None of it was accidental. Frank moved deeper into the cottage, searching carefully now. The place unfolded like preserved memory beneath lantern light. His mother's knitted blankets still folded beside the sofa. A stack of old Western novels near the fireplace. Kitchen shelves stocked with canned goods dated surprisingly recent. Coffee grounds, dry matches, fresh firewood. Somebody maintained this place regularly. Not abandoned. Hidden. Frank opened a narrow hallway closet and froze again. Inside hung military jackets. 3 of them. 1 old camouflage field coat. 1 heavy winter parka. And 1 dark blue jacket with faded Navy insignia stitched above the chest. Ramsey. Frank touched the sleeve slowly. The fabric still smelled faintly of gun oil and cedar smoke. Shadow whined softly beside him. "He was here," Frank whispered. A sharp gust rattled the boarded windows suddenly. For one split second, the sound transformed inside Frank's mind. Not wind. Rotor blades. Gunfire. Night operations. His pulse spiked violently. The hallway narrowed around him. Too tight. Too dark. Breathing changed instantly. Shadow reacted before the panic fully hit. The German Shepherd shoved hard against Frank's legs, forcing him backward into the kitchen, where open space broke the spiral. "Easy," Frank muttered hoarsely. But memories kept pressing forward. Afghanistan. Smoke. Cole Ramsey shouting over radio static. A burning convoy. Then nothing. Because after that mission, Cole disappeared forever. Or so Frank thought. Shadow placed both paws against Frank's chest. Firm pressure. Grounding. Frank focused on the dog's breathing. Slow. Steady. Present. Not then. Now. The panic receded gradually. Frank sat heavily at the kitchen table afterward, while Shadow rested beside his chair. The old coffee cup still sat near the stove. His mother's cup. He reached for it slowly. The metal felt cold despite the fire. A memory surfaced immediately. Winter storm. Age 12. His mother handing him hot cocoa inside that exact cup while snow buried the valley outside. "You listen to storms carefully," she told him back then. "Mountains talk before danger comes." Frank used to think that sounded foolish. Now, sitting inside the preserved cabin while armed strangers circled outside, he understood differently. The mountains had been talking ever since he arrived. He simply hadn't understood the language yet. Shadow suddenly stood, alert again. The dog moved toward the stone fireplace and sniffed low near the floorboards, then pawed once against the wooden planks beside the hearth. Frank frowned. "What now?" Shadow pawed harder. Scratch, scratch. Focused on one exact section near the fireplace stones. Frank lowered the lantern carefully and knelt beside the dog. The wood looked ordinary at first glance. Then he noticed faint scrape marks around one narrow plank. Not age. Movement. His pulse quickened. Frank grabbed the fireplace poker again and wedged the tip carefully beneath the edge of the board. The plank lifted. Cold air rushed upward immediately. Below the floor sat darkness, not crawl space darkness, depth, a hidden compartment. Shadow barked sharply once. Frank lifted the board fully aside. A narrow metal hatch appeared beneath it, built directly into concrete foundation. Military grade. Old but solid. No handle visible. Only a combination dial. Frank stared at it in disbelief. What the hell was this place? Shadow stood beside the hatch, completely still now, tail low, ears forward, waiting, almost expectant. Frank brushed snowmelt from the metal surface. Then his stomach tightened. Stamped faintly into the steel hatch were 3 faded letters. CIA. Frank sat back slowly. His mother had lived here, raised him here, cooked meals and folded laundry and planted flowers outside this cabin. And beneath the floor sat a hidden intelligence bunker. The realization felt impossible. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Men visiting the cabin sometimes when Frank was a child. Always late at night. Always serious. His mother telling him to stay in his room. The man he called father arguing about operations and deliveries. Frank always assumed it involved logging work. Now he wasn't so sure. A soft sound outside interrupted him again. Engine noise. Vehicle approaching through snow. Shadow spun instantly toward the window with violent growls exploding from his chest. Headlights swept briefly across boarded windows, then stopped outside the cabin. More than one vehicle this time. Doors opened. Voices carried faintly through wind. At least 3 men, maybe 4. Frank extinguished the lantern again. Darkness flooded the cabin. Outside, boots crunched through deep snow toward the porch, while mountain wind screamed across Bitter Creek. And beneath Frank Mercer's feet, hidden under decades of silence, the sealed bunker waited to finally open. The first knock came hard enough to shake the front door. Shadow exploded into barking. Not warning barks anymore. Combat barks. Aggressive, violent, protective. Frank grabbed the lantern, but kept it dark. The cabin remained buried in shadows except for dull orange glow leaking from fireplace embers. Another knock. "Open up!" a voice shouted through the storm. Frank moved silently toward the side window and lifted the blanket edge just enough to see outside. 3 men stood on the porch. Heavy winter gear. Flashlights. One carried what looked unmistakably like a rifle slung beneath his coat. Another man waited near 2 black SUVs parked beside the tree line below the cabin. Professional. Not local hunters. Not lost travelers. The same man from earlier stepped forward again. "We know somebody's inside." Shadow's growls deepened into something Frank had only heard twice before. Once during a PTSD episode inside a crowded Denver subway station. The other time during a break-in attempt behind Tyler's house 2 years earlier. The dog sensed danger before violence happened. Always. Frank crouched lower beside the hidden hatch. His mind worked automatically now. Exit routes, angles, numbers, weapons. He hated how naturally it returned. Old SEAL instincts slid back into place like muscles remembering forgotten movement. The voice outside hardened. "Last warning." Then came the metallic sound of someone checking a rifle chamber. Shadow lunged toward the door so violently Frank barely caught the harness. "Easy," he whispered sharply, but the dog's body remained rigid with controlled fury. Frank looked down at the bunker hatch again. No choice. He wiped snowmelt from the combination dial. Think. What would his mother use? Birthday? Address? Then memory surfaced suddenly. A sentence she repeated constantly when he was young. Mountains remember dates better than people do. Frank stared at the dial. October 14th, 1968. The day he left Bitter Creek forever. Or thought he had. He turned the dial slowly. The lock clicked open instantly. Frank froze. Shadow looked down at the hatch, looked, then back toward the pounding door. The men outside had started forcing the handle now. Wood creaked beneath pressure. Frank pulled the hatch upward. Cold air rushed from below, carrying smells of concrete, oil, and old metal sealed away for decades. Dark stairs descended beneath the cabin. Military construction. No question anymore. "Move," Frank whispered. Shadow went first immediately. The dog disappeared into darkness without hesitation. Frank grabbed the lantern, lowered himself into the bunker, and pulled the hatch shut above them just as the cabin door finally splintered open upstairs. Voices flooded the cottage overhead. "Clear the rooms!" Flashlights swept across floorboards above Frank's head while he stood frozen inside absolute darkness beneath the cabin. His heartbeat thundered. Shadow pressed close against his leg, but remained silent. Good dog. Always a good dog. Frank forced himself to breathe slowly. The bunker smelled untouched, yet maintained somehow. Dry air, gun oil, dustless concrete. He lit the lantern carefully. Warm light revealed a narrow underground corridor reinforced with steel beams and old military wiring running along the ceiling. Frank stared in disbelief. The bunker extended much farther beneath the cabin than expected. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls. Radio equipment, storage crates, maps, filing cabinets. Everything preserved perfectly. And on the far wall beside an old American flag hung another photograph. Cole Ramsey. Older this time. standing beside Shadow near the cabin porch, dated 6 years earlier. Frank's stomach tightened. 6 years. The exact year Frank adopted Shadow. The dog already knew Bitter Creek because this had been home. Above them, footsteps pounded across the cabin floor. "Nothing down here. Search again." Frank extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the bunker once more. He heard furniture moving overhead, drawers opening, angry voices echoing through floorboards. Then one sentence froze him cold. "Granger's gonna lose his mind if the old man got here first." Frank exchanged a look with Shadow despite the darkness. Old man. They meant him. Someone had expected him eventually. The realization settled slowly inside his chest. This wasn't random. Bitter Creek had been waiting, and apparently other people had been waiting too. Shadow suddenly moved deeper into the bunker, purposeful, focused. The dog stopped beside a large metal cabinet near the rear wall and pawed at it once. Frank relit the lantern cautiously. The cabinet door carried faded government markings beneath dustless steel. Classified material storage. Frank opened it slowly. Inside sat dozens of organized folders, sealed evidence bags, old cassette tapes, and military files stacked with obsessive precision. One name appeared repeatedly across nearly every file: Wade Granger. Another name beneath it: Operation Black Pine. Frank frowned. The files dated back more than 40 years. Cold War era, illegal weapons transfers, land acquisition records, government contracts, then photographs. A younger Wade Granger standing beside military officers near hidden airstrips deep in mountain terrain. And beside them, Frank's breath caught. His father. Not the drunk man who raised him. Another man entirely. Tall, dark-haired, wearing military field gear. The resemblance hit immediately around the eyes. Frank sat heavily against the metal shelf. His mother's voice echoed faintly through memory now. "You've got your real father's eyes." At the time, he never questioned what she meant. Now the truth cracked open beneath him all at once. The abusive drunk who raised him had never been his biological father. Frank stared at the photograph, while years of buried shame shifted violently inside his chest. His entire life he believed violence and weakness came from blood. That he inherited failure. But this man in the photo looked nothing like weakness. Shadow rested his muzzle gently against Frank's arm, grounding him again. Always grounding him. Frank turned another photograph over. Cole Ramsey appeared beside the same man years later. Then more recent photos, surveillance shots, property maps. Bitter Creek Valley outlined in red marker. Every acre tracked carefully. Whatever this place contained, powerful people wanted it badly. Above them, the search continued. One man shouted from the cabin kitchen, "Check the fireplace!" Frank's pulse spiked. They were getting close. Shadow's ears lifted sharply toward the ceiling. Then suddenly, the dog moved fast. He crossed the bunker to a far corner Frank hadn't fully explored yet and stopped beside another metal door, partially hidden behind storage shelves. Frank followed quickly. The door led into a narrow escape tunnel reinforced with timber beams. Fresh boot prints marked dustless concrete. Recent. Someone else used this bunker not long ago. Very recently. Shadow looked back impatiently. The dog already knew the route. Frank realized it fully then. Shadow hadn't guided him accidentally. The German Shepherd had been trained for this. Every strange behavior since Denver suddenly aligned. The compass, the mountain routes, the urgency. The dog had been bringing him home deliberately. A crashing sound exploded overhead, floorboards breaking. "They found the hatch!" somebody shouted. Frank grabbed the nearest stack of files instinctively and stuffed them into his duffel. Shadow already waited inside the tunnel entrance. Ready. Frank extinguished the lantern again. Darkness swallowed them. Then the bunker hatch burst open above. Flashlights cut through blackness. "Down there!" Frank and Shadow moved immediately. The tunnel stretched beneath frozen earth like a buried artery beneath Bitter Creek. Narrow, cold, claustrophobic. Frank's breathing tightened instantly. Too enclosed. Too much like collapsed combat tunnels overseas. Panic clawed at him. Shadow sensed it immediately and slowed just enough to stay against Frank's leg while guiding him forward. Behind them, voices echoed through the bunker. "They're moving!" Flashlight beams danced through darkness somewhere behind. Frank forced himself onward. One step, then another. Snowmelt dripped from tunnel beams overhead while old memories battered him from every direction. Afghanistan caves, collapsed bunkers, men screaming underground. His chest constricted painfully. Shadow barked sharply once. "Focus, move, stay present." Frank pressed forward. The tunnel finally angled upward ahead toward faint moonlight leaking through snow-covered boards. An exit. Shadow lunged upward first, shoving through frozen planks with powerful shoulders. Cold mountain air flooded inward. Frank climbed after him and emerged beside the frozen creek, nearly 100 yards behind the cabin, hidden beneath heavy brush and snow-covered rocks. Night wind slammed against his face. Behind them, voices still echoed faintly from inside the bunker. They hadn't found the tunnel exit yet. Frank dropped beside a fallen pine log, breathing hard while Shadow scanned the tree line. Snow fell heavily now. Good. Fresh snowfall erased tracks quickly. Then headlights swept across the forest from the cabin clearing. The search had spread outside. Frank watched armed flashlights move between trees, while engines idled near the cabin below. One voice carried clearly through the storm. "Granger said if Mercer shows up, we bring him in alive." Frank froze. Mercer. They knew his name. The realization landed heavier than the cold. This wasn't about trespassing anymore. Somebody powerful had expected him to return to Bitter Creek long before he even remembered the place existed. Shadow pressed close beside him beneath the falling snow, while the valley stretched dark and haunted around them. And somewhere inside the hidden bunker beneath the cabin, the truth about Frank Mercer's entire life waited buried inside decades of classified secrets. The mountains had remembered him after all. Now the question was why. Frank lay motionless beneath the fallen pine while snow drifted across his coat and settled over Shadow's fur in soft white layers. Below them, flashlight beams moved through the trees surrounding the cabin. The men were spreading outward now. Systematic, experienced, not random hired muscle. Frank watched them carefully through gaps in the brush. One man guarded the vehicles while two others searched near the creek. Another disappeared back inside the cottage carrying what looked like one of the bunker files Frank had failed to grab. His stomach tightened. Whatever secrets were buried beneath Bitter Creek, Wade Granger already knew enough to fear them. The question was how much. Shadow remained perfectly silent beside him. Years earlier, Frank had once asked a military trainer why some retired service dogs adapted so deeply to human emotion. The trainer answered simply, "They stopped thinking of themselves as separate from the handler." Frank understood that now. The dog beside him wasn't following commands anymore. Shadow was protecting family. A sudden burst of radio chatter echoed faintly through the storm below. "Negative contact near the East Ridge. Keep looking. Granger wants confirmation." Frank narrowed his eyes. Confirmation. Not capture. Not arrest. Confirmation. As if they needed proof he'd truly returned. The realization settled heavily inside him. Someone had spent years expecting this exact moment. Shadow nudged Frank's arm once, then stood. The dog turned uphill toward thicker forest. Frank hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay hidden until the search moved farther away. but Shadow stared at him with absolute certainty. Then the German shepherd moved quietly into the trees. Frank followed. The forest rose steeply above Bitter Creek. Snow muffled their footsteps while moonlight filtered weakly through towering pine branches overhead. Frank's knee burned harder now. Age and cold worked together like enemies. Still, he pushed onward behind Shadow, deeper into wilderness. The dog never hesitated once. Not at forks. Not at ridgelines. Not through dense snowfall. He knew exactly where he was going. An hour later, they reached another structure hidden high above the valley. Frank stopped cold. An old ranger station sat tucked between massive pines overlooking Bitter Creek from the mountainside. Abandoned, or so it appeared. The wooden structure leaned slightly with age beneath heavy snow, but faint light glowed behind one boarded window. Shadow barked softly once and moved toward the porch. Frank's pulse quickened again. Another hideout. Another preserved building. Whoever built this network prepared for decades. He climbed the steps carefully, every board creaking beneath snow weight. The front door stood unlocked. Warm air drifted out immediately. Frank entered slowly. The ranger station interior smelled of cedar smoke and old paper. A cast-iron stove glowed near the far wall beside shelves filled with canned food, blankets, medical supplies, and radio equipment. Someone lived here, or had recently. Then Frank saw the tapes. Dozens of labeled cassette tapes lined a wooden table beneath an old lantern. Each carried handwritten dates, and one name repeated across nearly every label: Ramsey. Frank approached slowly. Shadow moved directly beside the table and sat, waiting, almost ceremonial. Frank picked up the nearest tape carefully. November 12th, 2019. Another, April 3rd, 2021. Then one label stopped him entirely. For Frank, if he ever comes home. His hands trembled. No! Shadow rested his head gently against Frank's side. Frank stared at the tape several long seconds, before finally noticing the old cassette recorder sitting beside the lantern. Still plugged in. Ready. The storm howled outside while Frank slowly inserted the tape. He pressed play. Static crackled softly. Then a familiar voice filled the room, older than Frank remembered. Tired, but unmistakable. Frank, if you're hearing this, then Shadow found you. Frank stopped breathing. Cole Ramsey coughed faintly on the recording. I always figured he would eventually. Static hissed briefly. Frank lowered himself slowly into the nearby chair. Shadow lay beside his boots. I don't know how much time passed between this recording and you arriving here, Cole continued. Could be months, could be years, but if you made it back to Bitter Creek, then life finally cornered you hard enough. Frank closed his eyes. The words hit too close. Cole gave a weak laugh on the tape. Sorry about that, brother. Another cough. Then silence before Cole continued more softly. Shadow belonged to me before Denver, before the VA program, before everything fell apart. Frank stared at the dog. Shadow looked up calmly. I trained him specifically for one purpose after Afghanistan, to find you if anything happened to me. Frank's chest tightened painfully. What? Cole continued. You remember Operation Black Pine? Frank's stomach dropped. Fragments surfaced instantly. Afghanistan. Secret transport routes. Missing weapons shipments. Corrupt contractors. A classified operation buried so deeply, most surviving personnel never spoke about it again. Cole's voice lowered. We found things over there we weren't supposed to find. And when certain people realized we knew too much, they started cleaning up loose ends. Static crackled again. Frank's pulse hammered now. I disappeared officially because it was safer than staying visible. Your father helped me disappear. Bitter Creek became one of the fallback sites. Frank sat frozen. My father? Another pause. Then Cole answered as if hearing the question decades away. Yeah, Frank. Your real father. Outside, wind battered the ranger station walls. Inside, Frank's entire understanding of his life shifted again. Cole continued quietly. Your mother protected you from all this because she knew what these people were capable of. Wade Granger's family spent 40 years burying evidence tied to Black Pine. Land seizures, weapons routes, government contracts, veteran disappearances. Frank remembered the photographs from the bunker, the files, the surveillance maps. Your father tried exposing them, Cole said. That's why he vanished. Frank gripped the edge of the table tightly. All his life he believed his father abandoned them, or died, or simply disappeared because he didn't care. But now, he loved you, Cole said suddenly. Frank's eyes snapped shut. The sentence landed like physical impact. Your father stayed hidden because he believed Granger would kill your family if he resurfaced. Bitter Creek became the safe house protecting both you and the evidence. Frank's breathing shook slightly. Shadow lifted his head immediately, grounding him again. Always there. Cole's voice softened further. I found you in Denver 6 years ago after your wife passed. You didn't recognize me because honestly, brother, I looked like hell by then. Frank's mind flashed suddenly. A memory. A homeless veteran outside the VA clinic. Gray beard, baseball cap, watching him from across the parking lot. Frank barely noticed him at the time. Cole, Jesus Christ. I couldn't tell you the truth directly, Cole continued. Too dangerous. But I could give you Shadow. Frank looked down at the dog again. Shadow's amber eyes reflected lantern light calmly. He already knew your scent from old photographs and recordings. Smartest dog I ever handled. I trained him to bring you home if things ever went bad. Frank felt tears burning suddenly behind his eyes. Unexpected. Violent. He hadn't cried since Helen's funeral. Maybe before that. I figured eventually you'd run out of road, Cole admitted quietly. People like us always do. The tape hissed softly. Then came the words that broke something open inside Frank completely. You were never abandoned, brother. You were hidden. Frank covered his mouth roughly. The room blurred. Years, decades, all the shame he carried, all the belief that he'd been unwanted, disposable, forgotten. A lie. Shadow climbed halfway into his lap, despite age and size, pressing firmly against Frank's chest, while the old seal finally broke apart in the dim ranger station above Bitter Creek. Not dramatic sobbing, something quieter, more devastating. The sound of a man discovering his entire life had been built on the wrong wound. Cole's voice continued gently through static. If you're hearing this, Granger probably knows you're back already. That means the clock started moving. Another cough. Under the floorboards near the stove, there's a second cache. Letters from your mother. Evidence copies. Financial records. Everything you'll need. Then one final pause. Take care of Shadow, Frank. The tape crackled softly. He spent 6 years protecting you before you ever understood why. Silence followed. The tape kept spinning. Frank sat motionless while snow buried the mountains outside. Shadow rested against him quietly. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Frank Mercer no longer felt like a man wandering through the world unwanted. Someone had spent decades building a road home for him. Even the dog had known before he did. Frank sat in silence long after Cole Ramsey's tape stopped spinning. The ranger station creaked softly around him while snow piled higher outside the windows. The fire inside the old cast-iron stove snapped and shifted, throwing orange light across shelves lined with supplies that had clearly been stocked for survival, not comfort. Shadow remained beside him. Steady, warm, real. Frank rested one trembling hand against the dog's neck and stared at the silent tape recorder. All those years, all the nights lying awake in Tyler's basement, believing he had become a burden no one wanted. All the years before that, carrying the belief that abandonment was somehow stitched into his blood. And the truth had been sitting buried beneath Bitter Creek the entire time. Not abandoned, protected. The difference nearly broke him. Outside, wind swept through the mountains with a deep, mournful sound that reminded Frank of ocean storms aboard Navy destroyers decades earlier. Strange how memory worked. One sound pulling another behind it like chain links underwater. Shadow lifted his head suddenly. Alert. Not danger this time. Expectation. The dog stood and moved toward the wood stove in the corner of the ranger station, then pawed once against the floorboards. Frank exhaled slowly. Right. Cole mentioned another cache. He grabbed the lantern and knelt beside the stove carefully. The old floorboards looked ordinary at first glance until he noticed faint cut marks around one narrow section near the wall. A hidden panel. Frank wedged his knife beneath the edge and lifted. The compartment beneath contained a weatherproof military case sealed tightly with rubber clasps. Inside rested bundles of letters tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. And sitting on top of them was a photograph. Frank froze instantly. His mother, young, standing beside the same man from the bunker photographs. The man with Frank's eyes. Snow drifted softly around them in the picture, while Bitter Creek rose behind them untouched by time. The man held a baby wrapped in a blanket. Frank. He stared at the image for a long moment, before reaching carefully for the first letter. The envelope carried his name in his mother's handwriting. Frankie. Nobody had called him that in over 60 years. His throat tightened immediately. He opened the letter slowly. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and age. If you are reading this, then two things happened. First, life finally became cruel enough to drive you back here. Second, Shadow succeeded. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Even now, his mother wrote with certainty instead of hope, as if she had always known this exact moment would come. He continued reading. I wish I could tell you this in person. I wish I could have protected you from the weight of these truths while still giving you the life you deserved. But some dangers survive by staying hidden, and some men survive only by disappearing. Your real father was named Daniel Mercer. Frank's chest tightened sharply. Daniel, not the violent drunk who raised him in Pennsylvania after Bitter Creek. Daniel Mercer. The name felt both foreign and familiar somehow. He kept reading. Daniel worked in covert military intelligence during the Cold War. He was not perfect, but he was brave in ways most people never understand. When he uncovered illegal weapons operations tied to powerful contractors and government officials, he tried to expose them. Wade Granger's family was part of those operations long before Wade himself inherited them. Frank's hands tightened around the letter. The Grangers again. His mother continued. Daniel discovered routes moving weapons and money through hidden valleys along Montana and Wyoming. Bitter Creek became one of several unofficial safe locations used to hide evidence and protect witnesses. When people started disappearing, Daniel knew we would become targets too. Frank remembered strange men visiting the cabin late at night when he was young. Maps spread across tables. Quiet arguments behind closed doors. His mother telling him not to come downstairs. He never understood any of it. Until now. Another line stopped him cold. The man who raised you after we fled Bitter Creek was never meant to become your father. Frank stared. His pulse slowed strangely. Cold clarity settling into place. Harold, the angry factory worker, the drinking, the violence, the years of fear. His mother's words continued carefully. Harold agreed to help us disappear after Daniel vanished. At first, I believed he was saving us. I learned too late that broken men often hide their damage until they feel ownership over someone weaker. Frank lowered the letter slowly. For years, he blamed himself for not protecting his mother better, for leaving home at 17, for escaping. Now another truth unfolded beneath everything else. She had been trapped too. Snow rattled softly against the station windows while Frank kept reading. I never told you the truth because the fewer people who knew about Daniel Mercer, the safer you remained. Granger's people searched for decades. They wanted the land because they believed Daniel hid records somewhere beneath Bitter Creek, proving what they did during Black Pine. Frank thought about the bunker, the files, the surveillance maps, the armed men searching the cabin. She was right. They never stopped looking. The next paragraph hit even harder. You spent your life believing weakness came from your father. I need you to understand something before I'm gone. It didn't. Frank stared at the words as tears blurred the page again. You inherited Daniel's loyalty, his stubbornness, his need to protect people even when it destroys him. Those are dangerous qualities in this world, but they are not shameful ones. Frank leaned back heavily against the wall. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before. Not in 72 years. Not with certainty. Not with love that clear. Shadow moved closer immediately, resting his head against Frank's shoulder. The old SEAL finally allowed himself to cry fully then. Not quietly this time. The grief came deep and raw after decades buried beneath discipline and silence. For Helen. For the boy he used to be. For the years spent shrinking himself inside Tyler's basement, believing he deserved no better. Shadow stayed against him through all of it. A soldier standing watch. Eventually, Frank wiped his face roughly and reached for the second bundle of papers inside the case. Legal documents, property trusts, bank records, land deeds. Every acre surrounding Bitter Creek had been placed into protected trusts decades earlier under shell ownerships designed to avoid Granger acquisition attempts. His mother preserved everything carefully. Waiting. Preparing. And then Frank found the final envelope. Smaller. Unsealed. Inside rested a single handwritten note. If Granger finds you before the truth becomes public, go to Rebecca Sloan in Missoula. Frank frowned. Attached beneath the note sat an old business card. Rebecca Sloan, former military prosecutor. The card looked recent. Very recent. His mother couldn't have placed it there herself, which meant someone else updated the cache after her death. Cole. Frank suddenly understood. Cole Ramsey kept maintaining the system long after she was gone, protecting the evidence, protecting Bitter Creek, protecting him. A deep crack echoed outside suddenly. Gunshot. Shadow exploded upright instantly. Another shot followed farther down the mountain. Then engines, multiple vehicles. Frank moved to the darkened window carefully and lifted one edge of the blanket. Headlights cut through snowfall below. The search teams had spread across the valley, and now they were moving uphill, toward the ranger station. Frank's pulse hardened instantly. The grief vanished beneath training. Instinct returned cold and sharp. Shadow growled low beside him. Frank looked down at the dog. You knew this was coming too, didn't you? Shadow stared back silently. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Cole's final words on the tape. The clock started moving. Frank looked again at the stacks of evidence spread across the table. Letters, photographs, proof. enough to destroy powerful people if it reached the outside world, which meant Granger would never stop hunting him now. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, something unfamiliar settled slowly into Frank Mercer's chest. Purpose. Not survival. Not hiding. Purpose. For the first time since Helen died, he understood exactly why he was still alive. Outside, headlights climbed steadily through the snow toward the ranger station, hidden high above Bitter Creek. And beside the old soldier who had spent years believing he was forgotten, Shadow stood ready once again to lead him through the coming war. The engines below grew louder through the storm. Frank counted 3 vehicles. Too many lights. Too organized. Granger wasn't searching anymore. He was closing in. Shadow stood rigid beside the window, amber eyes fixed on the approaching beams cutting through snowfall below the mountain ridge. Frank moved quickly now. Not panicked. Focused. The shift surprised even him. For years he had lived like a man apologizing for taking up space. Quiet. Smaller. Careful not to inconvenience anyone. But Bitter Creek had awakened something buried beneath grief and humiliation. Purpose. Mission. The old instincts returned without asking permission. Frank swept the ranger station methodically. Supplies first. Water. Medical kits. Maps. The cassette tapes and letters disappeared into his duffel, alongside the bunker files he'd rescued earlier. Then he opened a locked storage cabinet near the back wall. Inside rested 2 military rifles sealed in oilcloth beside ammunition boxes. Frank stared at them silently. Cole Ramsey prepared for this too. Of course he had. Shadow moved beside him calmly while Frank inspected the weapons. Old but maintained perfectly. 1 scoped hunting rifle. 1 compact tactical carbine. Frank checked both automatically. Clear chamber, magazine condition, sights, muscle memory returned frighteningly fast. He hated that part. The body never truly forgot war. Outside, vehicle doors slammed. Voices echoed faintly through trees below. "They're up here!" Snow crunched heavily beneath boots climbing toward the station. Frank exhaled slowly. "Guess hiding's over." Shadow gave a low, rumbling growl. Frank grabbed the hunting rifle instead of the carbine. Less aggressive. Cleaner distance. He still wasn't looking to kill anybody. Not unless forced. That mattered to him. The old Frank would have disappeared deeper into the mountains right then. But another thought settled heavily inside his chest. If he ran now, Granger would burn Bitter Creek to the ground searching for evidence. The cabin. The bunker. His mother's entire life's work. Gone. No. Not happening. Frank moved to the back window overlooking the narrow mountain trail leading toward the ranger station. Perfect choke point. Only one clear approach through deep snow and trees. The men below spread cautiously now, flashlights cutting between trunks. Professionals. But impatient professionals. One stepped too far ahead of the others. Frank aimed carefully and fired once. The bullet struck a tree trunk inches beside the man's shoulder. The crack echoed violently through the mountains. The search team scattered instantly. "Sniper?" Good. Fear slowed people down. Frank chambered another round calmly. Shadow barked sharply beside the window. Movement left side. Frank shifted immediately. Another man attempted flanking uphill through dense trees. Frank fired again, deliberately low. Snow exploded at the man's feet. The intruder dove behind cover, cursing loudly. Still no killing. Still warning shots. But the message landed clearly. The old man wasn't helpless. Radio chatter erupted below. "Fall back! Get cover! Call Granger!" Frank moved away from the window before return fire arrived. Smart. Always move. 2 bullets punched through the station wall seconds later, spraying splinters across the room. Shadow reacted instantly, shoving against Frank's leg and forcing him lower. "Easy!" The dog remained pressed beside him, ears forward, waiting for the next threat. Frank's heart hammered hard now, not from fear, adrenaline. He recognized the feeling immediately, combat chemistry waking after years asleep. And beneath it, something darker stirred too, the dangerous part of himself he spent decades trying to bury, the part that solved problems violently. Frank forced it down hard. This wasn't Afghanistan. These weren't enemy combatants. Control mattered. Outside, a voice shouted through the storm, "Frank Mercer!" Frank froze. The voice continued, "You don't want this getting worse." Wade Granger himself. Frank recognized wealthy authority instantly, smooth, calm, educated, the kind of voice that expected obedience. Frank moved cautiously toward the front window. Below, a tall man in a black winter coat stood beside the SUVs beneath swirling snow. Mid-60s, silver hair, expensive boots sinking into mountain drifts he clearly wasn't used to walking through. Wade Granger. Even from a distance, Frank could see confidence radiating off him like heat. The confidence of a man who spent his life owning things. Land. People. Silence. Granger raised one gloved hand. "I know who you are now." Frank remained silent. Granger continued calmly. "Your father caused a great deal of damage years ago, chasing ghosts that should have stayed buried." Frank's jaw tightened. "My father buried evidence," Granger called upward. "Evidence people would kill to keep hidden." Shadow growled low. The wind carried Granger's next words sharply through the trees. "You really think the government's going to protect you once this goes public?" Frank answered finally. "They protected you long enough." The mountain fell quiet after that. Snow drifted through flashlight beams below, while Granger studied the dark ranger station above him. Then he smiled faintly. "You sound like Daniel." The use of his father's name hit harder than Frank expected. Granger noticed. "Your father believed exposing black pine would change something," Granger continued. "Instead, it destroyed everyone around him." Frank's grip tightened around the rifle stock. What happened to him? Granger's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not guilt. Memory. "Your father made enemies he couldn't outrun." Not an answer. Frank recognized deflection immediately. Shadow suddenly barked violently toward the forest east of the station. Frank spun. Movement. Another team circled behind them while Granger kept him distracted. Professional. Frank cursed under his breath. The flankers opened fire first. Bullets shattered the ranger station windows. Glass exploded inward. Shadow lunged instantly. The dog slammed Frank sideways behind the stove just before another round tore through the wall where his head had been. "Damn it!" The old station erupted into chaos. Wood splintered. Snow blew through shattered windows. Flashlight beams danced wildly outside while Granger's men advanced uphill beneath covering fire. Shadow barked furiously beside Frank, tracking movement through sound faster than human eyes could. Frank fired once through the side wall. A man cried out outside. Not dead. Hit. The others slowed again. Good. Every second mattered now. Frank grabbed the duffel and moved toward the rear exit. The ranger station wouldn't hold much longer. Shadow stayed tight beside him. Then another shot cracked through the storm. Different angle. Different sound. Shadow yelped sharply. Frank's stomach dropped instantly. The dog stumbled sideways, blood spread across black fur near his shoulder. "No!" Frank dropped beside him immediately. Shadow tried standing again despite the wound, growling toward the trees. Still protecting. Always protecting. Frank pressed shaking hands against the injury. Not fatal, through muscle, but bleeding badly. Rage hit him then. Sudden. Cold. Violent enough to scare him. The old SEAL inside him surged upward hard. Not the tired, homeless veteran, the operator, the killer. For one terrifying second, Frank wanted to end every man outside that station. Shadow whined softly beneath his hand. The sound cut through the rage immediately. Frank inhaled sharply. Control. The dog trusted him. That mattered more than revenge. He wrapped the wound quickly using supplies from the medical kit while bullets continued striking the station walls. Then a new sound interrupted everything. Sirens. Distant but approaching fast from somewhere down the mountain road. Granger heard them too. Frank saw the shift instantly. Not panic. Calculation. The wealthy developer stepped backward toward his SUV while speaking rapidly into a radio. The attack team began withdrawing almost immediately. Efficient, disciplined. Within seconds, engines roared beneath the storm. The vehicles retreated downhill through swirling snow. Gone. Frank stared after them in confusion. Who called law enforcement? Then headlights appeared farther down the ridge. One vehicle. Moving carefully uphill through deep snow. Not police. An old green pickup truck finally emerged through the storm and stopped outside the shattered ranger station. A woman stepped out carrying a flashlight and shotgun. Late 50s, gray coat, hard mountain face weathered by real winters. She looked directly at Frank through the broken doorway, then at Shadow bleeding on the floor. "About damn time somebody found you," she muttered. Frank frowned. "Who are you?" The woman lowered the shotgun slowly. "Name's Rebecca Sloan." Snow whipped around her beneath flashing headlights. "And your mother told me 20 years ago this day would eventually come." Frank stood frozen inside the shattered ranger station, while wind carried snow through broken windows behind him. Shadow lay beside the stove, breathing hard, blood dark against black fur. The woman stepped fully inside, shutting the door against the storm with one boot. Rebecca Sloan, late 50s, sharp eyes, the kind of face shaped by courtroom battles and mountain winters equally. She lowered the shotgun slowly and looked directly at Frank. "You look like Daniel." Frank swallowed hard. Everyone kept saying that now, as if his real father had been standing invisibly beside him his entire life waiting to finally be recognized. Rebecca's eyes shifted toward Shadow immediately. "That dog needs stitches." Frank crouched beside the shepherd protectively. "He'll live." "Didn't say he wouldn't." Rebecca set down a medical bag near the stove. "But Granger's men aren't known for clean shooting." Frank stared at her. "You know about Granger." Rebecca snorted softly. "Everybody in western Montana knows about Wade Granger. Most are just too scared of him to say much out loud." She knelt beside Shadow carefully. The old military dog growled low at first, but allowed her closer after one glance from Frank. "Easy, partner." Rebecca inspected the wound quickly. "Passed through the shoulder. Lucky angle." Frank held Shadow steady while Rebecca cleaned the injury with calm efficiency. "You were military?" Frank asked quietly. "Military prosecutor. JAG Corps." She threaded a needle carefully. "My father served with Daniel Mercer before Vietnam." Frank watched her hands. Steady. Experienced. "How long have you known about Bitter Creek?" Rebecca tied off the final stitch. "Long enough to know your mother was smarter than everyone chasing her." Shadow flinched once but stayed still throughout the procedure. "Good soldier." Rebecca leaned back afterward. "There. He'll hate you tomorrow, but he'll survive." Frank rubbed the dog's neck gently. "Thanks." Rebecca studied him silently several seconds. Then her gaze drifted toward the duffel bag overflowing with letters and files. "You found the evidence?" Frank nodded once. "Enough to bury Granger?" Rebecca's expression darkened. "Maybe." Not confidence. Honesty. Frank appreciated that more. The storm outside intensified while Rebecca lit another lantern near the table. The ranger station glowed softly now beneath warm yellow light, despite shattered windows and bullet holes. A strange, fragile calm settled over the room. Rebecca removed wet gloves carefully. "Tell me exactly what you found." Frank laid everything across the table slowly. The photographs, Operation Black Pine files, property records, Cole Ramsey's tapes, and finally, his mother's letters. Rebecca read in silence while wind moaned through the mountains outside. At one point, she stopped turning pages entirely. Her jaw tightened visibly. Frank recognized anger when he saw it. "What is it?" Rebecca looked up slowly. "These land records." She tapped one stack carefully. "Granger Holdings didn't just target Bitter Creek." Frank frowned. Rebecca spread several maps across the table. Red marks covered valleys throughout Montana and Wyoming. Remote ranches, veteran-owned properties, abandoned airstrips, cabins. The Grangers spent decades forcing veterans off strategic land parcels tied to old black pine roots, she explained quietly. Some through lawsuits, some through intimidation, some just disappeared. Frank felt cold settle deeper inside him. Veterans? Men easier to discredit. Rebecca met his eyes directly. PTSD, addiction, financial collapse. Society stops listening after a while. Frank thought immediately of Denver. Bus stations, homeless vets sleeping beneath bridges while people walked around them pretending not to see. Rebecca continued. "Your father started documenting it before he vanished. Cole kept collecting evidence after him." She pointed toward one photograph buried beneath the files. Frank picked it up carefully. A younger Wade Granger stood beside several county officials shaking hands near a bulldozed property line. Behind them sat an old farmhouse marked condemned. Another photograph showed the same property 2 years earlier. A veteran named Samuel Reddick standing proudly beside it in Marine Corps dress blues. Below the image, someone had handwritten, "Found dead 6 months later. Official ruling, suicide." Frank's stomach turned. "How many?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. "That we know of?" she said finally. "At least 19. Silence filled the station afterward except for wind and the crackling stove. Frank stared at the photographs. All those men. Discarded. Buried quietly. Made small. Just like Granger tried doing to him. Rebecca broke the silence first. "We need to move fast now." Frank looked up. "Why?" "Because Granger already knows you have enough evidence to destroy him." She pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. The headline read, "Granger Holdings announces major veteran housing initiative." Frank stared at the smiling photograph beneath it. Wade Granger shaking hands with politicians beside American flags. Rebecca's voice hardened. "He built an empire pretending to help veterans while destroying the ones who got in his way." Frank's hands curled slowly into fists. Not rage this time. Resolve. Rebecca pointed toward the cassette tapes. "If those recordings mention federal contracts tied to Black Pine, we can trigger an official investigation." Frank thought of Cole's voice, the exhaustion in it, the years spent hiding. "You really think the government will listen now?" Rebecca held his gaze steadily. "No. I think the press will." Frank almost smiled faintly at that. Smart woman. A sudden engine sound outside interrupted them. Both froze instantly. Shadow struggled upright despite the stitches. Headlights approached the station again through heavy snow. Frank grabbed the rifle immediately. Rebecca extinguished one lantern. The truck stopped outside. Doors opened. Voices. But different this time. Nervous. Not tactical. A man shouted through the storm. "Rebecca?" Rebecca exhaled. "Relax." She moved toward the door and opened it carefully. Two county deputies stood outside beneath swirling snow, young, cold, overwhelmed. One deputy looked at the bullet holes in the station walls and muttered softly, "Jesus." Rebecca stepped onto the porch. "Did Granger call you?" The older deputy nodded uncomfortably. "Said armed trespassers opened fire on his security team." Frank laughed once quietly behind them. The deputy looked embarrassed. Rebecca folded her arms. "You see any security team still here?" "No, ma'am." "You see any trespassers besides a 72-year-old veteran and his injured service dog?" The deputy hesitated, then glanced toward Frank standing inside the station beside Shadow. Something shifted in the young man's expression. Recognition. Respect. Maybe shame, too. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. "Go back down the mountain and tell Wade Granger this situation just became federal." The deputy blinked. "Federal?" Rebecca handed him one of the black pine files. The deputy skimmed 2 pages before his face drained pale. "Oh." "Exactly," Rebecca said. The deputies left quickly afterward, not eager to stay involved, smart enough to recognize danger. Frank watched their headlights disappear down the mountain road through the storm. "You trust them?" Rebecca shook her head. "Not particularly. But fear spreads fast in small towns once powerful people start looking vulnerable." She returned inside and shut the door again. Then she looked directly at Frank. "We go public tomorrow." Frank stared at the storm-dark windows. Tomorrow. Everything changed tomorrow. No more hiding. No more shrinking. Shadow leaned against his leg heavily, exhausted from blood loss and pain. Frank rested one hand gently on the dog's head. "You hear that, partner?" Shadow's tail thumped weakly once against the floorboards. Rebecca gathered the evidence carefully into waterproof cases. "We'll head to Missoula at first light. I know reporters. Federal contacts, too." Frank nodded slowly. Then another thought surfaced. Tyler. His son still believed Frank was some broken burden thrown out into snow with $2 and nowhere left to go. Funny how quickly life turned. Rebecca studied him quietly. "You okay?" Frank looked around the shattered ranger station, at the files, the letters, the dog who had spent years leading him home. Then he looked back toward the storm outside Bitter Creek. "No," he said honestly. A long pause followed. Then something steadier entered his voice. "But I think I finally know who I am." The wind screamed across the mountains through broken windows, while dawn slowly began rising somewhere beyond the snow. And for the first time in decades, the men who built their power burying veterans beneath silence had something new to fear. A soldier who had stopped running. The storm finally broke 2 days later. Morning sunlight spilled across Bitter Creek in long gold bands over untouched snowfields and frozen pine ridges. The valley looked peaceful again from a distance, almost innocent. As if men had never hunted each other there. As if secrets had not lived buried beneath the mountains for half a century. Frank stood outside the restored cottage with a steaming coffee cup warming his hands, while Shadow rested beside the porch steps, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The dog's shoulder had healed well, still stiff, still slower than before, but healing, like Frank himself. Far below the valley road, television vans and federal vehicles crowded the entrance to Bitter Creek. News helicopters occasionally crossed overhead toward the old Granger properties near the western ridge. The world had finally arrived. Rebecca Sloan stood beside Frank on the porch watching the activity below. "You know they're calling it the biggest land corruption case in Montana history now." Frank snorted softly. "People like labels." Rebecca smiled faintly. 3 weeks earlier, they had driven through the night to Missoula, carrying every file, tape, and photograph recovered from Bitter Creek. Everything exploded after that. Cole Ramsey's recordings became national headlines within 48 hours. Federal investigators reopened Operation Black Pine. Veteran advocacy groups demanded criminal investigations into suspicious land seizures tied to Granger holdings. County officials resigned almost immediately once financial records surfaced publicly. And Wade Granger, the untouchable king of Western Montana development, found himself standing before cameras looking suddenly very old and very frightened. Frank remembered the final courthouse hearing clearly. Granger sitting rigid beside expensive attorneys, while Rebecca methodically dismantled 40 years of lies piece by piece. The photographs, the property records, the hidden trust accounts, the veteran disappearances, and finally, Daniel Mercer's sealed testimony recovered from Bitter Creek itself. That testimony buried Granger completely, not because it was emotional, because it was precise. Dates, names, transactions, everything. Frank remembered Granger offering him money privately afterward. Millions. Enough to disappear quietly forever. The same old deal powerful men always offered inconvenient people. Take the smaller thing. Cause less trouble. Frank had looked him directly in the eyes and answered calmly, "My whole life people tried to make me smaller." He remembered Shadow sitting beside his chair during that conversation, stitched shoulder wrapped beneath bandages, staring at Granger without blinking. Frank smiled faintly now, remembering the expression on Granger's face afterward. Fear. Not of violence, of exposure. The world had finally seen him clearly. Below the porch, volunteers unloaded lumber near the old barn structure at the edge of the property. The sign hanging beside it read, Bitter Creek Veterans Retreat. Frank still wasn't entirely used to seeing the words. Rebecca followed his gaze. "You built something good here." Frank looked across the valley slowly. The old cottage had been restored carefully over the past few months. New roof, repaired windows, fresh timber reinforcing the porch, but some things remained unchanged intentionally. His mother's coffee cup still sat near the stove. The old photographs still lined the walls. The bunker beneath the floor remained sealed again, except for protected federal access. Certain scars deserved preserving. More veterans had started arriving recently too. Not crowds. Just a few at first. A former Marine sleeping out of his truck after losing his home in Idaho. An Army medic struggling with addiction recovery. 2 retired military dog handlers helping rehabilitate abandoned service animals. Broken people. Good people. People who needed somewhere quiet to land. Frank understood them immediately. Maybe because he had once stood on a frozen porch with nowhere left to go, too. Shadow lifted his head suddenly toward the driveway. Vehicle approaching. Frank smiled softly. Probably him. A dusty blue pickup truck rolled slowly toward the cottage through packed snow. Tyler stepped out carefully. Older somehow than when Frank last saw him in Colorado. Smaller too. Guilt did that to people. Frank watched his son stand awkwardly beside the truck, staring at the valley around him. The restored cottage. The retreat buildings. The mountains. Tyler looked overwhelmed by all of it. Rebecca squeezed Frank's shoulder gently. "I'll give you space." Frank nodded once. Shadow rose stiffly beside him, but stayed close. Always close. Tyler climbed the porch steps slowly. Snow crunched beneath his boots. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Tyler looked down. "I saw you on television." Frank waited quietly. Tyler swallowed hard. "I didn't know where else to go." Funny sentence. Frank remembered saying nearly those exact words silently to himself outside the Denver bus station months earlier. Tyler glanced toward Shadow. The dog watched him carefully, but without aggression. "You look better," Tyler said softly. Frank almost laughed at that. Better. After everything, maybe he did. Tyler's voice cracked slightly. Dad, Frank raised one hand gently. Not angry, just tired. Tyler stopped speaking immediately. The silence between them stretched across years. Missed phone calls, basement dinners, the sound of a locked door closing behind a barefoot old man. Frank finally spoke quietly. You don't have to explain what happened. Tyler stared at him. I should have stopped her. Yes, Frank said honestly. You should have. The words landed heavily, but truth mattered now. No more shrinking truth to protect comfort. Tyler nodded slowly. Tears filled his eyes almost immediately after that. I kept thinking about you out there in the snow. Frank looked toward the mountains beyond Bitter Creek. So did I. Another silence. Then Tyler whispered, I thought you were broken. Frank glanced down at Shadow resting against his leg. So did I. The wind moved softly through pine trees surrounding the cottage. No shouting, no dramatic forgiveness. Just two men standing inside consequences. Eventually, Frank stepped aside from the doorway. You hungry? Tyler blinked. What? I made chili. The old familiar sentence nearly broke Tyler completely. Frank saw it happen in real time. Because for years, Frank cooked meals in silence downstairs while trying to become invisible inside someone else's house. Now he stood in his own doorway offering food again. Only this time he wasn't shrinking. Tyler wiped at his eyes quickly and nodded. Yeah. Good. Frank opened the door wider. Take your boots off. Shadow hates muddy floors. Tyler looked at the dog uncertainly. Shadow stared back a long moment, then slowly moved aside. Permission granted. Inside, warmth wrapped around them immediately. Fire crackled inside the stone hearth. The cottage smelled like coffee, wood smoke, and simmering chili. Home. Tyler stopped just inside the doorway, staring at the photographs lining the walls. Daniel Mercer, Cole Ramsey, Frank's mother. Generations of people who spent decades protecting one another across silence and time. This place is incredible, Tyler whispered. Frank looked around quietly. No, he said softly. This place just waited. Later that night, after Tyler fell asleep on the old couch near the fire, Frank stepped outside alone carrying his coffee cup. Snow covered Bitter Creek beneath silver moonlight. The valley stretched silent and peaceful beneath the mountains. Shadow limped out onto the porch beside him and settled heavily near the steps. Older now, gray beginning around the muzzle. Tired, but peaceful too. Frank lowered himself carefully beside the dog. For a while, neither moved. The cottage windows glowed warmly behind them against the frozen dark. A light in the wilderness. A place prepared long before the people needing it finally arrived. Frank rested one hand gently against Shadow's thick fur. You didn't just save my life, partner. The dog looked up slowly. Frank stared out across the snow-covered valley his mother spent decades protecting for him. Then he smiled quietly into the cold Montana night. You brought me home. And high above Bitter Creek, beneath endless winter stars, the light in the cottage window burned steadily against the darkness at last. If you believe no veteran should ever be forgotten, comment home below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Sometimes dignity isn't about revenge. It's about finally finding a place where nobody can make you feel small again. And if stories about justice, loyalty, and standing your ground still mean something to you, subscribe and come ride the next journey with us.